Well, welcome back to the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of sending you into the great void, filling your reality with nightmares, and drawing upon the fears of all the people at the table.
And I'm host number 2, DM Neal, aka Jotmaniac.
All right, perfect. Well, there we go. Guess what? We're doing ridiculous voices, so yes, it is time for our annual Halloween episode. Neal, I'm really excited about this. We have a fantastic guest, a very appropriate guest for this show today. We have Veronica from Cthulhu and Friends here to talk with us about running a adventure or a campaign surrounded where your PCs are versing an unstoppable, undefeatable evil.
Yes, an absolute wealth of knowledge on the topic because Cthulhu and Friends, as some of you may or may not know, I don't know how continued the storyline is, but essentially different groups of people, or rather different groups of characters play, because in Cthulhu you die. Like, that's like one of the main conceits of the game.
Yes.
And so she has done that kind of campaign multiple times, and like I said, an absolute wealth of knowledge on the topic.
Yes, and so stick around for the meet. It's going to be fantastic. We have a lot of great inspiration for some creepy horror type games for you. But Neal, obviously we have some 5-star reviews, and so now we're going to bring you those in some creepy voices as we do every Halloween. So Neal, take us away.
Okay, so all of our reviews are coming from Canada today. America's hat. And man, it makes us look good. So, with that, we have our first review from
Brapady. 5 stars. Huge inspiration. This show has been a source of countless gems and new perspectives on the art of running games. It inspired me every step of the way as I designed a custom world and ran the best game I ever have. Check out the Institute RPG podcast to listen to this epic D&D 5e story. Well played on Shameless Plug.
Oh,
yes,
gosh. Thank you so much, Brapady. Our next one comes from Damon619, and it's entitled Take Notes, 5 Stars. I'm a fledgling DM and I've learned so much from this podcast. I'm on episode 46 and already have a notebook full of notes and am well on my way to create my own world. Thank you, DM Mitch and DM Chris. You guys have helped me push past my insecurities around telling my story and becoming a DM. Your DM for Dummies episode was very helpful. Keep doing what you are doing and don't ever stop. So thank you so much, Damon619. Neal, you must read the next review.
Yes, master. I'm sorry, I have a bum leg and a hump. Here I come. Yes, it's from Cheesy T11. Perfect for new DMs. I came across this podcast as I was searching for ideas to spice up my first attempt at DMing. I like spices, like the Eye of Newt and Wing of Bat. I'm only about 20 episodes in, and I'm already completely hooked. Ha ha ha, I like the hooks. It's fantastic, funny, and full of great ideas. Thanks, guys, for helping me turn my so-so beginner quest into an epic adventure. It's alive! It's alive! Ha ha ha!
Oh gosh. Okay, thank you so much for that review, and thank you, Neal, for doing that voice. Neal, it's very weird because halfway through that I was like, oh, Neal's Igor voice sounds very similar to a lot of merchant voices that I have in my world.
Yes.
Come buy this.
I'm a merchant because I can't get anywhere.
Well, with that, let's head to the meat.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
Why can't we have some meats?
The flat meat's back on the menu, boys.
Today for the meat, this very special version of the meat, maybe it's tainted meat, rotten meat, who knows, but it's Halloween. So we decided to bring a super special guest with us, and it is none other than Veronica, game master and producer of the Cthulhu and Friends actual play podcast. Veronica, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We're excited to have you on. We're going to start off today and kick it off with asking you a couple questions. So first is probably Neal's favorite question to ask any of our guests. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, whatever that entails?
Sure. This is a very specific question, and I get it a lot. So I've got something ready to go out of the can. So my name is Veronica. I was born many years ago. The place I was born is now a grocery store, so there you have it. That place completely cursed. I have been running an actual play podcast for the past, I think, 5 years now, so it's been a long time. And what's, I guess, really interesting from my perspective is, of course, I run a horror podcast. I am terrified of everything. I have only ever seen the first full season and half of the second season of The Walking Dead. I watched that in the middle of the afternoon with all of the windows open. And I was behind my couch so I could run in place and duck and hide so I could be safe. So very scared of everything, which I think is what kind of makes me pretty keen on being able to slip into people's fears and horrific things.
Scaring other people. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I'm terrifying because I terrify myself.
You know, if zombies do come at you during The Walking Dead, having the windows open is probably not your best strategy.
That is fair, actually.
That is my first thought as well.
This at all. But you need to be able to see your attacker, so,
That's true.
But I feel like we are kindred spirits because I had not watched anything scary for a long time. Then The Walking Dead came out. It was probably midnight. And I was like, everyone seems to enjoy this show. I'll watch the first episode. And the scene with the hands coming out of the door, I was all, cool. I'll watch it 12 hours from now.
It's like too
I'm done for
spooky.
now. I'm done for now.
Yeah, I think that I grew up around a lot of really irresponsible teenagers that let me watch horror movies when I was way too young. So I have an irrational fear to this day of leprechauns. And so I take off of work during St. Patrick's Day, stay home. I do not like it. It just freaks me out. It's scary. But the last, I think, legit horror movie that I had seen before I watched The Walking Dead was Hellraiser. And so that gives you a clue as to I was not prepared for the massive special effects that were going to be coming at me from The Walking Dead. So
That's awesome. So for our next question, we have, what have you been working on lately? And I always put this caveat now that you can share with our listeners because a lot of people have stuff that they can't talk about.
Sure. So, I think the thing that I'm actually working on tomorrow, we are relaunching our entire podcast. So we have new players, new setting. It's a completely new world. So if people haven't listened before, they can actually hop right into this season. You don't have to know any of the backstory for any of the characters. So this is our 7th season, and it's all brand new, and it's really exciting because I typically run really long-term pulpy campaigns, and so I don't have to worry about, how am I going to bring in such and such, favorite NPC? It doesn't matter. I get to start over, and so I'm really excited about that. I have been creating little trinkets and things that I'm actually mailing out to my players. So I have the first 20 or so episodes that are already ready to go. They have all of these clues and everything. So when they get to a particular scene, instead of me just describing, you find this artifact or something, they'll have this box. They open it up and I'm like, okay, pull envelope E12. and they can all pull out envelope E12, and that'll have the physical whatever it is that they need to look at so they can actually see it.
That is amazing. There's nothing else. It's just amazing.
That's it. Yeah. So I work in a maker space, and so I have access to a huge CNC router, laser cutters, 3D printers, all sorts of stuff. And so it's been really fun to kind of figure out what I can make while I'm here that I can send out to the players.
That's fantastic. I count myself lucky because I work in a place with a printer that I can use for D&D, but
Same here.
When everybody else is
also
out
have a
of the
printer.
office, I should say.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, you printed an entire book off that thing? Yes, I did. 7 seasons.
100%.
That is quite the undertaking. So 7 seasons. So when's the movie coming out for Cthulhu and Friends? Because that's next, right?
Oh, man. Yeah, that'd be so fun. I think every time we have a new cast, of course, we play in horror, so we have characters that just drop dead. And what's really fun, I think in our last Q&A, we had a who would play this character, and it was really neat to see everybody's perspective, which famous actor they would like to have represent their abs, essentially. So
Nice. So we have, to round this interview off, a surprise question for you. This one comes from one of our Patreon dragons, DM Pax. And so he's asking this question, and it's a specific D&D mechanic, but I think that the idea of it is still really, really great to ask someone who runs Cthulhu games all the time. So DM Pax asks, what is your greatest critical failure that you've seen in games? And I thought that would be great to hear what a GM of Cthulhu games would consider the greatest PC critical failure that they've experienced.
that's fair. So a little bit of background on how I actually learned how to play role-playing games. So I actually learned how to play from my friend Mike, who's on the show with me, but I actually learned how to DM from a guy that played back in the 70s with Gary Gygax.
Oh,
So
that's fantastic.
that's where my DMing style comes from. And so any critical failure for me is almost like, it's not even a coin toss as to whether or not you're going to die. You just kind of, it's probably a good 70% chance that you're going to die or have stepped now onto a path to imminent death. I think the best failure I've ever seen is, oh my gosh.
I have a mechanical question, though, in relation to Call of Cthulhu, because, so in Dungeons and Dragons, it's a 5% chance that you could critically fail because you roll a 1 on a d20. Is a true critical fail essentially a 1% chance in Call of Cthulhu?
So you have several opportunities to fail, not just in your dice roll for action, but in your dice roll for sanity. So you could pass something, and I guess, so my answer to the question is a critical fail actually being a critical success. In a horror game, you don't always want to hear and see everything. So I think the best one that I've ever had was someone rolling a crit 20 on something. And it was, I think, on a perception. And they saw and heard everything. And it stuck with them. And when you can hear the outer darkness and the creepy crawlies that are not supposed to be in your consciousness, I think that's the worst. And that led them on a path to, okay, now we're going to be making a sanity roll. And in the sanity rolls, that's all on a percentile die. And it's all based on your wisdom, what you've seen in the past, all kinds of different factors. So the more you play the game, the more likely you are to fail your sanity. And this particular character was just ready to, drop off completely. So.
That's fantastic because in a D&D game, the players are always excited for, oh, look at that. I got a 27 to my perception check. And it's I don't even know if I can think of a time where a perception check gone right has the potential to go so very wrong. But idea of just like, this is not the time that you want to be perceptive. You wish that you didn't see what you saw. And I think that just sets the tone so much for this episode. So thank you, DM Pax, for that for that question, and thank you so much, Veronica, for that answer. Let's start talking about this Halloween episode, what we came here to talk about, this idea of unstoppable evils. This idea that, Veronica, you can probably speak to this the most, but that I think Call of Cthulhu has this feel to it, that it's not so much about beating the evil all the time, but maybe stopping the evil for a time or just surviving the evil. But there isn't this classic Dungeons and Dragons feel of winning, slaying the beast. What is this? How does this play out in a role-playing game? This not typical sense of winning.
Sure. So I think that essentially, if you're playing a Call of Cthulhu and really any game that's based in horror or based where, essentially you might be the villain as well, you never need to set up your players to feel like they're playing a game to win. They're playing a game to survive. And that's it. And survival may not even be the thing that their characters want to do. So we've had characters that get to a point where they have survived as long as they want, and then they're at that tipping point, and I'll get a direct message of like, I don't think my character can make it any further. I think we may, end this character's life. And I'm like, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So your players really have to be committed to the role play of whatever character they're playing in. And that means like maybe that player commits, or maybe that character commits suicide. Maybe that character goes insane and refuses help. Who knows? When that happens, I always take over that player, I take over that character and then I use that as an NPC. So I think that was the biggest like shock to my players, was that, your time as this character may be over, but now I'm just getting started. So.
Yeah, it's such an interesting concept of, like you said, the unstoppable evil, where the idea of not being dead, but still not having your character anymore.
Oh, yeah. And your character making decisions that you would never make for it because, you want your character to survive. But a lot of times those crazed NPCs are never in it to live. But, they turn out like, oh, I'd like to usher in, this outer darkness or this outer god because I'm miserable. Everyone else should either be equally as miserable or dead. So.
Yeah, I think of it like in the sense of if you want to do a horror campaign or just adventure, a lot of the times it helps for me to think of the story as in being either a TV show or a movie. And so if you look at TV shows or movies that are of that horror genre, kind of like you're saying, surviving might be, that's the goal, is to survive this evil that's coming after you. But even in horror movies, sometimes we go and see a horror movie, and sometimes at the end, the people who are in danger, they make it out, and their lives are probably forever changed, and they have to go to a lot of therapy because of what they went through. But sometimes we go and see a horror movie as well, and nobody makes it out alive. And so the goal might even be who can survive the longest against this unstoppable evil. So you can have adventures where you're trying to stop an unstoppable evil from coming in and destroying the world or whatever that looks like. Or it may just be who can survive against this unstoppable force the longest amount of time.
And that can seem like to some players, especially I think to newer players to tabletops, like something that's not fun because, you really get primed to want to save the world. But it can be a lot of fun if you implement things like artifacts. So we have a lot of artifacts in our game that transition from world to world and game to game. So your character may be able to, dig a hole and place this, mirrored box or something in there. And centuries later, someone's going to find it. And that may be your character. It may not be, but those are little things that your characters are going to be really excited to, see like, oh yeah, it's the mirrored box. And then as the GM, you have to, just gently remind them, your character doesn't know what that does. So why don't you open it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point too, because this idea of an unstoppable evil could also be some sort of indestructible item. And
100%.
how do you can't, if you can't destroy it, what is the goal then? The goal might be, like you said, bury it deep, keep it hidden, don't let it out. And then with it not being able to be destroyed, as a GM, you're always thinking, okay, but someday that's going to be found and we're going to have more adventures with that.
Yeah, I think the most interesting one that my players have constantly, and we aren't in this world, so it doesn't matter to them. They won't care anymore. But one of the things that they frequently walked past in a game was kind of, oh gosh, what is it called when you go to the bank and they push out the little drawer to take your money or something? Like, so it's an old school thing for people that used to go to the bank before you could mobile deposit your checks.
Deposit boxes.
Deposit box. Thank you.
Boom.
Yeah. So I had deposit boxes all over this place, and they spanned for like 800 or so years of like, oh, there's a safety deposit box. What's in it? And I alluded to the fact that all of our NPCs were using it, but it was just a portal to another dimension. None of my players ever went in and got it. And I was just like, oh my gosh, you guys, this has been so cool.
I gave you the bread trail. Come on.
Yeah. Like, I led you there. Make a deposit.
It'll be fine. I promise.
Yeah. It's probably on me because I always take out money and currency out of my games because I despise keeping up with treasure. I'm like, we'll do a currency system, something, I don't know, a wealth system.
All right. Do we have anything else specifically on kind of, in general, this idea of how to run a game that doesn't have that typical winning mentality or against an unstoppable evil?
Yeah, I would say, honestly, if you're really interested in running a game for that unstoppable evil, to not expect to be able to sandbox a whole lot. It's really difficult to do. Another thing is to really put yourself in a time box of, I'm going to do maybe 10 sessions of this game with this group. That way you can pack in as many scares or whatever, but I wouldn't plan a long-term campaign. If it happens, it happens, but I would really plan small and then just, go from campaign to campaign, setting to setting, and really create each game like a 5-act, hour-long drama of like, here's the beat for Act 1, here's the beat for Act 2, and so on.
Yeah, because, especially looking to Cthulhu as an example, the dice can go sideways and it's over.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that's all there is to it.
Yeah, our group is actually switching to a brand new system to us, just so we can avoid these, oh man, everything is going sideways. But we're actually switching to Pellegrin Press Gumshoe, essentially.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
So that feels like a good segue into discussing good qualities for a campaign or an adventure where you're fighting against this unstoppable evil force, or like we said, an indestructible evil force. And so what are some qualities that GMs and DMs out there can add into a campaign or adventure that gives it the right kind of feeling, whether that's mechanical qualities or thematic qualities? What are some things that have worked for you, Veronica, in your Call of Cthulhu games to really set that mood that this is not about winning, this is about surviving, or how long, or just, not winnable?
Oh, yeah. I would say, honestly, to give your players as much connection to their current world as possible. So I always demand that the characters, when they're creating a backstory, every character has a really in-depth backstory. So we're talking like 2 or 3 pages for every single person. I want to know who they last, made out with, or who they last hugged. Do they have children? Why not? All of these things, precious pets, all sorts of things, because I really want their character to feel real to them. And that gives me every opportunity to take everything that they've ever loved away from them, just pick it off one by one. And so now my players initially were like, oh, I'm not going to tell her anything, that's not fun. And then, they really got into it as we went along. And I had a character who ended up having like I had everyone had like a full family. And I was like, oh, this is excellent. And, children were setting their parents on fire and all sorts of things. And it was great.
The players giving you ammunition to use in the correct way in a horror campaign. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that probably sets the stakes higher every time. The more that your players give you in their backstories, the more that you can use against them to make the stakes higher and higher and give that undefeatable, unstoppable feel.
Absolutely. And I think that having characters that have some sort of legacy that they can leave. So if they have a spouse, and I especially like it when they have children, because when that character inevitably dies, that child then can take up the mantle of their parent. And so you're going to run across them as like, oh, my father died. I'm going to do the thing. And I think that's really fun. And I think players think that's fun. So just being able to, have this long lineage of people that for whatever reason, it's just in their blood. They have to investigate things that should probably be left alone.
And it's an interesting thing because I think of how much we advocate for the idea of player agency, but I think part of having this unstoppable evil and building it into the campaign is that some of that absolutely gets stripped away because you need to have this evil exist on a level that is just not the same as like, well, if we don't go over to Mount Doom, we won't have a problem. We'll just stay in our hobbit holes over here and be good to go. But it's like even some of the most simplistic things, like you stare into a mirror for too long, now I need a sanity check because of the things you've seen and heard.
Yeah.
I think is a great way to really make that evil feel so much bigger.
One of the interesting things that I've actually DM'd and not in the podcast was we had players who were super cautious, and I don't like to push anyone to play anything that they don't want to play, So if they're not enjoying themselves, I'm not doing my job as a GM. So I like them to be able to do whatever they want to do. It's their world, right? But one of the things that I thought was really fun was we had players who were super cautious, didn't want to do anything. And they were like, we're going to stay in the Shire and it's going to be fine. And I was like, cool. Tell me what happens. And they give me I'm going to do this farm. I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm like, cool, you do that and you pass away from old age. Can you tell me what your new character is? And they're just, what? And I'm like, yeah, you have a great life. You have 3 kids. It's wonderful. Now what? And they're just, oh. And I'm like, yeah, we can just keep doing that. Or we can play the game that we were all really excited to play and go from there. So sometimes you'll just get into that, moment. And I think just give them a reality check of like, yeah, you don't have to play this game, but I thought we all wanted to.
Yeah. And I think that idea of buy-in is really, really important when you're doing a horror campaign. When you watch a horror movie and you're sitting there and you're going, no, don't open the door or don't open that box. Don't go in there. But that's what they need to do in a horror movie.
Yeah.
To make the horror happen. And so if you're playing in a game like that, find a reason, like you were saying, why your character is curious enough to investigate or is disbelieving of everything going on and no, I'll be fine. So that those things that your GM are setting up, and that's something that most of our listeners are GMs and DMs. So find ways to try to get your players on that same page, and that idea of buy-in, especially for this type of a campaign or adventure, it's really important.
Oh, sure. And I think that one of the things that's really cool about horror settings is that while we like to think that the team is collaborative and they're working together, really everyone is for themselves. I mean, unless there's some, crazy bond, if you have brothers and sisters, whatever, it's really every person for themselves. And there's always an opportunity in horror games for each player to take over the game for a second and say, I think I'm going to hurt so-and-so because my sanity is so low, or, I'm going to run faster even though normally I would take up the rear, and I'm going to let this person that is a medic or whatever get eaten. And sorry, guys, now we don't have a medic. So
that's something that I was thinking would be an amazing mechanic, if you built it into a horror survival like game, if you brought up Walking Dead. If you get bit by a zombie, what happens? You become a zombie. If there's an unstoppable evil like a zombie plague or something like demonic possession, something along those lines, not surviving might not just mean you're dead. It might mean the GM looks at you and says, welcome.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what your next moves are, because now you're on the side of evil. And you can still have that play among players who have quote unquote lost, or whatever you would want to say at this point. And then you have eventually this game where one single player is still surviving and the entire table is looking to bring them down.
I've heard that story, a story similar to that, and I mean, it's such an impactful moment for the table that obviously it's the kind of thing people talk about for a really long time. But if you're going into the idea of losing sanity and maybe getting taken over by this ultimate unstoppable evil, the idea of being like, okay, and then having the person actually physically get up and come behind whatever DM or GM screen and sit down there with you. Oh, that's
Pull
what I'm
up a
talking
chair.
about. Yeah.
Welcome, my friend. Would you like to roll some dice? Whatever it is.
That's actually probably a really good way to train a GM, to be honest.
Yeah. It's a trick. It's all a trick to get to get some co-DMing down here.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, boy, I could be a player in no time if I did that.
Then you just like slowly shift by playing an NPC more and more, and then letting them take over more of the monsters. Then before you know it, problem solved.
So, just suddenly Veronica has a character sheet.
Yeah.
Veronica, in games that you've played in the past with this type of feel, have you ever used the element of a race against time kind of feeling to stop evil before it gets to a certain point to build this suspense up?
Absolutely. I've actually done that a couple of different ways. One of those ways was to have a clock that the players didn't know was happening, and then to actually reset them every single time we played. So we would start at like 6:15 a.m. on Saturday the 14th, whatever. And then if they didn't get to a certain point and they don't know what this point is, they don't know what's going on, the next day they would wake up. It was very Groundhog Day, same time, same whatever. And for Cthulhu, it's really nice because time in and of itself is controlled by this outer god. Yog-Sothoth comes to mind, and it's the keeper of time and the keeper of the gate, and all of this good stuff. But yeah, I put my players up against the clock a lot, and a lot of times they fail because honestly, it's really difficult to get every single thing that you need to get done, and then to execute it well enough for it to work. So, and I try not to give my players a lot of, plans that I think they should make. I always put two NPCs in, and I have the angel devil thing going on. So I give them, the extremes of what I think could possibly go wrong. That always leaves them kind of like, oh, we should do this and try and go down the middle. And I'm like, great, we're never going to make it. And that's actually how we ended our last season, is just like, hey, everything's gone. You guys didn't make it, and the world ends. And that's cool.
I love that you said you actually set clocks up while you play. Mm-hmm. I think that that idea can really emphasize suspense in players when playing an RPG like this. I think 100%. I think of any sort of board game where you have that ticking clock or that the sand timer flipped, and it doesn't matter what the task is, but as soon as you know that you're under the pressure of time, the stress level just builds. And so put that into a horror setting, and I think that's perfect.
Yeah, typically, so we usually cut this out of what goes into the recording and into the podcast that gets released. But typically, you have any time that we're playing, you usually only have about 10 to 15 seconds to make your decision, and then we move on. So if you don't have something to go, you get skipped.
That makes sense why it would be cut. But that is also awesome because it's like, no. Again, that the concept I mean, even from a mechanical and time perspective of it's an unstoppable evil. So we're not stopping for figuring out what's going to happen for too long because it's going to happen.
I'm very bad at designing puzzles. And so the time is something that I use to get away with having a really crappy puzzle that I've put in front of my players. So.
You failed. It goes off.
Mm-hmm.
I think one more question as far as the qualities that I would ask you is because we're talking about this idea of you can't physically defeat whatever this evil is. You cannot slay it. It's too strong. You're not going to be able to do that. Where would combat, if at all, come into play in a game like this? How would you use combat in a game like this, if at all?
Yeah, I don't ever like to force combat just because I think, gosh, there's so many good ways to resolve conflict without it. But sometimes, a player is really adamant about, trying to defeat something. I mean, even your baby monsters like level 2 and 3, they're going to kill you because your character's real squishy all the time. You can be a level 10 and you're still pretty squishy because you only have humans to pick from. So I guess in combat, it's mostly you're going to enter combat when your character feels like they're cornered and they don't have a choice, or if there's some sort of like ethical or moral reason as to why they would enter combat, because most of the time they're faced with something that, if you're familiar with the Cthulhu South Park, like that's usually the size of a monster that's, attacking you. There's nothing you can do short of like having access to all of the nukes in the world, and then still, what are you going to do with that? So it's really dumb to take it on, but it makes sense when the characters have that really strong backstory, and they were like, I'm going to go in because even though I'm going to die, at least I tried, kind of a thing. So
I feel like what you're saying here brings back your point of, I think preparation is something that's really important for these kind of games, because in a game that you're sandboxing, if you feel a little bit stuck, sometimes an easy way out of feeling stuck is throwing in some random encounters or something along those lines. But in this kind of a game, the characters should be avoiding conflict as often as they can, because even amongst maybe the minions of whatever this unstoppable evil is, death is still a very high probability.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting to try and turn your players into some sort of either an evangelist or, kind of a town crier where, they've seen these horrors, and, whenever you come into a situation of like, oh, I don't really have anything planned here, to have someone walk across that looks like, oh, this might be a person that they could convince, and give them time to really think through what they've been through, vocalize that, and interact with an NPC. So you can kind of hear as the GM, okay, what is my player actually thinking? How are they seeing everything that's happened to them? And what can my next best move be for them? So I think giving them opportunities to tell the story of what's gone on is huge in horror games. So where you would, I think, be tempted to throw in, a band of goblins or whatever, in this you actually throw in dialogue and, hear that story back from them.
And then break their minds.
Yeah.
So the last thing that I think we want to do before we finish this discussion is just give some of our listeners some ideas of adventures and campaign ideas, some story hooks that they could use if they wanted to do a game like this, where you were fighting an unstoppable evil. So what are some ideas that we have for enemies or events, encounters, things that can fill this idea of being an unstoppable evil that the players are trying to race against time against, or just survive or stop, hopefully, for now?
So I get to pull, because of Cthulhu and Friends, I get to pull from H.P. Lovecraft. So if you're unfamiliar with H.P. Lovecraft, he was this pulp horror writer, from early in the 1900s. it's a lot of really good material that's really great for a one-shot or maybe a 2-game campaign. So you can read these stories in maybe 2 or 3 hours. You can get them on audiobook. A lot of them are just read by people that are really brilliant voiceover artists on YouTube. Just listen to those and kind of pick up where all of these clues are as people in the stories kind of fall into madness. You can also pick up a ton of stuff from watching things like, CSI, or even like your cop dramas, medical dramas, and just take something like, oh, well, someone got into this horrific situation. How did they get there? And then just create your own little backstory. I'm actually taking some unsolved mysteries that I listened to on some podcast, and I was like, oh, that'd be a really good hook for a complete campaign. I have 20 episodes that are completely surrounding this one podcast that I heard about a missing kid. So I think just listen to things that are mysterious, and then, take one or two things, and you're probably going to be creative enough to pull some hooks and to decide like, oh, well, I'll take this element from Cabin in the Woods and this element from Hellraiser, and, just keep going.
That's awesome. I think another term that keeps coming to mind now is not only the unstoppable, but in some way the unreachable evil, or untouchable. I think it's another good term, because you can only do so much, and that's kind of the whole point of like building these things and creating all of this. I mean, if you want to use 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons as an example, the reason the gods don't have stats is because if they have stats, then you can kill them. Like, I mean, that's that potential mentality there, and like that's kind of the point. At best, maybe you could fight an avatar, and that kind of goes towards in the elder gods as well. Is like you have this entity or this creature, and like it is still the greatest thing you will probably ever face, and that's not the thing that is in the background actually running and doing all of these things in the world.
I was just gonna say, and I think bringing up like gods, as you both have, is a perfect place to start with the idea of this unstoppable quality. There are, like you were saying, Veronica, there's so much out there about just each specific elder god from the Cthulhu mythos. And I think that's a great place to start and read about these gods and what exactly would happen if this god were to enter the material plane, the mortal realm, and the chaos that would ensue from that. And you can go and you can just be inspired by those Cthulhu gods, and you can create a god for your own homebrew world that fits just like that. And the question I would ask is, what stopped that god from getting to the material world so far? Is there a specific order that has stopped them, and what happens if that order dies out? Or are there cults trying to bring forth that elder god, and maybe that's what this night takes place, this adventure takes place, is trying to stop this cult from bringing them back, but that leaves you as the DM to end the night on a very dark, well, we stopped this cult for now, but the evil is still there, is still present, and cannot be killed. And when is it next going to be? When next will there be a gate open to allow it to come through?
Oh, sure. I saw this really interesting thing. Someone tagged me on some social media of how if you made a campaign that was strictly about stopping cultists, how interesting that would be. Because if you imagine cultists as ants in an anthill that start chanting your name, you're going to walk outside and check out like, what the heck is happening? And you're just a random human, and just going from, colony to colony and stopping them from, calling out the human. And I thought that was really interesting. There's a lot of really good cult, real life cult stuff that you can glean and, introduce into your game. But cults are so easy to just enter into the game. So even if you didn't plan on having a cult in this game, they're, I would say like maybe they're actually really good at, being that game that you didn't quite have time to prepare for. So, yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of very frightening elements that if you do that research on real world cults, beyond just fantasy world cults, that you can take and use as great inspiration to creep your players out.
Oh, for sure.
I was also thinking on this show, we've talked a lot in past episodes about gaming in a post-apocalyptic type world, but I think this exact thing that we're talking about of like trying to survive this unstoppable evil is a great time to go and start to inspect that apocalypse that happened and the end of the world as we know it, and play an adventure out during that ending, before that post-apocalyptic world that perhaps you've created from your world, but to play at that very end and to play a survival game while this unstoppable force or this unstoppable evil just renders the world completely lifeless or whatever it is.
Oh, sure. One of the things that I like to do is to take natural landmarks that we know exist, that we believe are real, to put your characters back in some kind of crazy old time, fail, and then you're like, oh, that's where the Grand Canyon came from. That makes sense. You know, just little things like that that kind of hook you in like, oh, crap, that's really huge, and gives scale to whatever it is that, you know, you're into. With Call of Cthulhu, we've actually played in the 1950s, 2808, like all sorts of things. And so it's been really interesting to see kind of how people change their characters based on their setting. So
Awesome. Well, I mean, I'm inspired. I'm going to go crush the souls of every player I have.
huzzah.
So, huzzah. So is there any final piece of advice that we want to give before kind of wrapping it up?
I think just let your players try anything.
I like it. I don't have anything better than that. I don't want to say anything now.
I suppose my final piece of advice would be, I think we have a lot of great ideas for your gaming for a Halloween scary type session with your players. I would say don't be afraid to also set the mood with props and with maybe some candlelight, and
Oh, yeah.
especially if we're doing after Halloween, go to the store, buy that cheap Halloween stuff that the stores are just trying to get rid of, and you could be all set for either next year, or it doesn't need to be on Halloween. Scare your players anytime, all the time.
Go get your red balloon, fill it with helium, keep it in your backpack, and at just the right moment, unzip your bag
Yes.
and let that fly up. Be fine.
Amazing.
Perfect. Well, we have one other important question for you, Veronica, and that is, where can people go to find you on the internet?
Yeah, you can find me super active on the Twitters at Typical Veronica, and you can find my podcast at CAF Podcast.
There you go. Well, and then, of course, thank you again for coming on, scaring us, hopefully scaring our
Yes.
listeners, and above that, of course, inspiring us and our listeners to scare their players.
Yeah, anytime, guys.
And we just want to thank Veronica again for coming, spending some time with us, teaching us the ways of fighting unspeakable evils, and I don't know, for me personally, solidifying the fact that she definitely needs to come back on for another episode, because
Absolutely.
the Elder Gods are, I think that's what we should do. We should try and convince her to come on to talk about the Elder Gods.
Elder guys.
But if you want to tell us about the unstoppable evils in your games, you can always head over and email us at dungeonmasterblock@gmail.com. And of course, if you want to shamelessly plug your podcast in a review, head on over to iTunes, leave a 5-star review, and as always, we will read it on air.
You can follow us on Twitter at DMS_block. That's at DMsBlock. And you can also like our Facebook page. Both of those places are the best places that you can go if you would like to have updates about the show, see when episodes drop, links to guest Twitter pages, and all other good stuff.
And this week, our Patreon shout out goes to
Playerless DM!
who is a gold dragon and is tearing up all of the things that gold dragons tear up.
Tear,
So thank you, Playerless DM. And
Thank you
hopefully
so
you find
much.
some players.
Absolutely. The Dungeon Masters Block is a proud member of the Block Party Podcast Network. Check out other shows like Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters, Detentions and Dragons, Geek Wars, and more.
And as always, thanks for listening to the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we come before the Dark Lord, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of becoming a god,
Beheading characters,
and eating the entrails of all of the people at the table. I've been one of your hosts, DM Neal, aka Joke Maniac.
And I've been Dungeon Master Mitch.
Happy Halloween,
Yep, good night and good luck.
and keep on dungeon mastering.
I am already recording.
All right, good. Here we go. Glad I'm not in my workplace with everybody who can walk past the door and hear me. Oh, like Neal. All right, here we go.
I shouldn't have looked at you. I shouldn't. I was fine until I looked like right at the end. I need to get off the internet. I typed in Creepy Canada. It's an actual show. It's a real show that you could watch.
I noticed the way I was going through that. I was like, holy crap, this voice is really slow.
Yeah,
And
as soon as he started it, I was like, I wonder what he's going to do when he gets to the review. Bad call.
Bad call all around. At least I have the one. You have the two.
This review comes from... Nope, that's too high-pitched. I can't do it that way.
No, that was great. Nope, that's too high pitch.
I can't sustain that. There's absolutely no imaginable. Not possible. Not possible. Oh no, I can't even find it.
I really hope somebody walked past your
Well,
door.
the funny thing is, no one can walk past. But that means if someone is at my door, they are specifically at my door to remain there until they have my attention. So, luckily.
Goodbye.